Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the 2025 Milton Konvitz Lecture. I'm Alex Colvin, Dean of the ILR School, and it's my pleasure today. I'll be introducing our speaker, Elizabeth Anderson, who is the Max Shaye Professor of Public Philosophy and also the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor and the Arthur Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan. I want to thank everybody who's joining us today in person and online. I know we have a number of online participants. I particularly want to thank Irwin and the late Joan Jacobs. The Jacobses are extraordinary benefactors of many important causes throughout the world, including many at Cornell, and including this lecture at ILR, for which we're very grateful for their support for this. This is ILR's signature lecture, in honor as a founding faculty member of the school, Professor Milton Konvitz. The lecture was endowed by the Jacobses in 2005 to honor the spirit of Professor Konvitz's theoretically rich and diverse course, American Ideals. Dr. Jacobs and generations of students at Cornell, there's estimates of 8,000 students took this course over the years at ILR. And there's actually a link on ILR's webpage where you can actually download and listen to a recording of an entire semester of this course. It's quite amazing. He actually would just come in and just start speaking and just speak for like an hour, in this sort of very rich, complex fashion. This lecture brings a prominent expert in American democratic thought, ethics, or political philosophy to speak to the campus community. Previous lectures have included John Ruggie, Sandra Day O'Connor, Cass Sunstein, and Charles Ogletree, among many others. It honors Professor Konvitz, who was really a remarkable teacher, but also scholar and public citizen. He was an authority on constitutional labor law and civil and human rights. He served here on our faculty and on the law school faculty from 1946 until 1973, eventually passing away in 2003 at the age of 95. He was a devoted public servant of our university, including serving as the founding founder of our university's Department of Near East Studies and its program on Jewish Studies. Now, I'd like to turn to introduce our speaker today, Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Professor Anderson specializes in moral, social, and political philosophy, feminist theory, social epistemology, and the philosophy of economics and the social sciences. She's the author of the books Value in Ethics and Economics, The Imperative of Integration, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, and most recently, get hot off the press, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. And she's written many articles as well on various topics, from the ethical limitations of markets to facts and values in social scientific research, feminist and social epistemology, racial integration and affirmative action, and many other topics. She's currently working on a history of egalitarianism. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, was a 2019 MacArthur Fellow, and she's also designed and was the first director of the program in philosophy, politics, and economics at University of Michigan. It's an absolute pleasure to have her here at the ILR School today. I'm very much looking forward to her talk. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a great honor to be invited to this distinguished lecture. And I must say, I'm always interested in speaking to an interdisciplinary audience that includes people who aren't just all philosophers. And so I really, really, truly, it's a huge pleasure for me to talk to you today. So let me start by discussing a particular case in Ann Arbor. It happens where I live. I'm going to tell you a little story about Brookdale Senior Living. Brookdale is the #1 U.S. operator of senior assisted living facilities in the United States, and there's a picture of the one in Ann Arbor. What was going on? Well, private equity took it over in the early 2000s, and what they instituted was what I'll call assembly line care. So they divided all of the tasks that needed to be done in this assisted living facility, and then they kind of created an assembly line of people who would go through each of the tasks. And they had some algorithmic timing of the tasks. So they experimented and they figured out like what was the minimum time required to perform each task, like, feeding a patient in a memory unit, bathing, dressing and so forth. And that enabled them to dramatically cut the staff who were serving the patients and to speed up the flow of task completion. Well, they made huge profits this way. Is this a model of corporate success? Well, you might think so. It did really put out the profits, so they're maximizing shareholder value. And you could justify this on grounds of productive efficiency, right? They're not wasting any resources. They're not wasting time on required tasks. They're maximizing labor productivity. Looks good. They're even Pareto efficient, arguably. Well, you have to make a lot of assumptions for the first theorem of welfare economics to apply, as you're all aware. But the theory is, of course, that if businesses are missing no opportunity for increasing their profits, then like the whole system in equilibrium will be nice and efficient in the sense that all opportunities for mutual gain have been exhausted. So kind of a good outcome. And it's interesting, this emphasis on efficiency, because that all came from the Protestant work ethic. And of course, we have our great Max Weber, who wrote the greatest single work on the Protestant work ethic, entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in 1920. And this is how he characterized the work ethic. Well, industry is important, right? Working as hard as possible. That's something that the managers put on the employees. Frugality, you don't waste any time doing anything, right? That's the productive efficiency. Puritans were obsessed with not wasting time. They hated idleness. Everything, every moment had to be put to some use. And then, of course, to make as much money as possible, to maximize shareholder value. And that's, of course, part of the whole Pareto efficiency aspect. And Weber insisted that the Puritans believed that you were entitled to make money and should make money, maximize the amount of income you make by any legal means. Now, I underline that because I actually think he's reading these Puritans wrong. Okay, I think I'm going to challenge that in particular. And so if we go back to Brookdale senior living, what actually was happening? What was the experience of patients and workers in their facility? Well, essentially, when you say you're going to, be efficient in the completion of tasks, what's really happening is the algorithmic timing eliminating any time to care for personal or relational needs. Memory care unit patient gets upset or maybe is afraid because they don't know where they are anymore, or who is this person taking care of me. A lot of emotional distress from the loss of memory, communicative needs of various such things. And, once you feed the patient, they might be in tears because they're upset. You have to move on to feeding the next patient in the assembly line. And so what the workers experienced was, the patients experienced psychic distress and physical neglect, because if something complicated and time-consuming happened, the staff didn't have time to deal with it. Somebody falls or vomits or something. They don't have time to deal with it. Move on. And of course, the staff felt really bad about that, and they complained that not every patient's identical, and you can't always complete tests on time because stuff happens. Okay, they were complaining of patient neglect and the workers are getting exhausted at this pace, and they experienced moral injury, right? Because they're employed to care for the patients, like all of their needs, and not just the needs that the algorithm had assigned to them. Things are being lost here. And consequently, one way to look at how they managed to make so many profits is that they basically increase their profits by serving patients less well, exploiting vulnerable workers, and degrading their jobs. So on net, I don't think this is a positive value added here. Okay, they're making more profits by doing their jobs less well and abusing their workers. Okay, now this is I'm just use that as an illustration of something that's more general and not just confined to private equity, I'm calling this the new micro division of labor. So the original micro division of labor was what we saw with the Industrial Revolution and the factory system, famously described by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations when he went into this pin factory. And he said, it's so much more efficient. You can make so many more pins if instead of each worker making an entire pin, right, you have one worker cutting the wire, another one pointing the tip of the wire, another one sticking the head in, and so forth. That's micro division. Whereas the original division of labor was you have workers who are specialized producers of an entire marketable product, such as a boot or, a pewter plate or something, right? An entire product, or maybe a piece of cloth that could then be sold to turn into a suit, which a tailor would make an entire suit and so forth. So in the service industry, I'm calling that the new micro division of labor, okay? And it goes along with another feature of the organization of work, which is that employees, that is regular full-time employees, have more and more been replaced by temporary workers, part-timers, irregular workers, gig workers, workers on 0 hours contracts. That is, they have variable hours from week to week, and some weeks maybe no hours at all. So-called independent contractors, which might not actually be independent, but they're called that. And these workers tend to have unpredictable work schedules, typically where the work schedule is determined by the person who pays them. Sometimes they get flexibility about when they decide to work, but not always. Between 2005 and 2015, the rise of this kind of fragmented work amounts to 100% of net employment growth. Pretty shocking, okay? I don't have data for the last 10 years, but I think it's shocking enough just to see this happening so dramatically in the 21st century. And here's my friend Jerry Davis at the Ross School of Business. It's a great quote from him. He says, the corporate career, with a series of jobs bearing more responsibility and pay, was replaced by the job. And now the job is being replaced by the task, right? You're hired task by task. Like you go on your app, right? And you get a professional shopper from Instacart or something, and they just do one task, right? Just for you. And they move on. Now, I want to point out that professionals too are to a certain degree also being turned into gig workers. So besides the partners at a law firm, now you have lots of hourly lawyers who are just working for an hourly wage. Or, you'll have the notorious academic proletariat who now do the bulk of teaching at all the big schools. And they are hired term to term, course by course. Now, my university, I'm proud to say, has a unionized lecturer workforce. So they actually get a reasonable deal, and they do get a quasi tenure once they pass their major review. They get quasi tenure. They have a right of first refusal if you keep on offering the course again. Like they get first dibs on it. So that's not so bad. But at many places, literally, they don't know even from semester to semester whether they're going to be hired again for Spanish 101, even though the school knows perfectly well that Spanish 101 is going to be offered every single term. Okay, so they're in a very precarious position. There are many other professionals who are in that kind of, contingent labor. And they're also subject to more managerial control than back in the day when they could count on self-employment or partnership or something. More and more subject to protocols for how, the steps they have to take to do their job, and they have to check off the boxes of every step. And subject to quantitative metrics of their productivity. And whenever you do that to professionals, what it means is you're short timing your patients or your clients or whoever you're serving. because productivity is usually measured in ways that neglect all of these other values that are very difficult to measure, but are very important for the relationship between the professional and their client or their patient or their student or what have you. Now, what I've argued so far is that 21st century profit maximizing work designs with this micro-divided labor and sort of systematized and routinized, especially in the service area, but not only there, is leading to pervasive moral injury of workers. And moral injury here, I'm just going to define as harm from being coerced into engaging in wrongdoing or shortfall of the standard of care that one thinks is necessary to perform one's job well. And there are many other cases of this, not just at private equity. We can take a look at the Boeing MAX disaster, where you had the engineers actually who were deeply concerned about the safety of the aircraft, and management, who was very concerned about the stock price of Boeing, overrode their concerns because they wanted to rush the plane to market and avoid having to require pilots in the new Boeing MAX from having to take additional training, which would have actually informed them of the strange ways in which new safety technology was working, led to 2 crashes and hundreds of deaths. We can look at the Facebook algorithm, which actually researchers have found spreads hate and distrust and anger among people on the platform. It's not unique to Facebook. All of the social platforms have algorithms that kind of work this way, nearly all the big ones at any rate. Why? It's not like they necessarily want this end directly. It just turns out that what they're trying to maximize is attention and time spent on the app. And what rivets people's attention are things that get them upset. You might think if you were a hedonist, maybe you should get off, but people aren't thinking that way. Now, tech workers actually recognize this problem, and they said, look, Zuckerberg, we really should make a nicer algorithm so our workers are not being made so unhappy. They actually had direct data that more time on Facebook led to less happy users. And Zuckerberg, well, he had his own material interests here in profit, and he just overrode all of those concerns of the workers. We could have 100% nursing staff turnover at nursing homes, in some nursing homes, due to pay cuts and short staffing. People get exhausted, burned out. They feel the moral injury. Patients die. Patients die. Think about if you're a nurse whose basic job is maintaining life, and patients are dying because you're not allowed to spend the time needed to rescue them. How do you feel about that? Well, really awful, right? And that, of course, only leads to more turnover, which leads to less experienced staff, but also staff who don't know personally the patients they're caring for, don't know their idiosyncrasies, and consequently cannot adjust their care to the idiosyncrasies of the patient, whereas someone who really has a long-term relationship with the patient is much better able to cope and calm them down and help them and comfort them. We can take the case of Walmart, which pressures its pharmacists not to report suspected illegal opioid prescriptions because they were making so much money from it. Even though it's the law, and the Drug Enforcement Administration requires pharmacists to report suspected pill mills. Okay, and that is, of course, was a causal factor, one of many, that led to the crisis in opioid deaths, overdose deaths in the United States. Okay, and so in general, I would argue that contemporary work designs for ordinary workers and professionals alike in the human services field, it's harming clients and workers alike. Now, what I want to suggest, let's go back to the work ethic, which Max Weber would have looked at these private equity firms and so forth and said, well, they're like fully realizing what these Puritans thought work should be. And I went back and actually read the sources he cited, a bunch of Puritan theologians, and I think he was wrong. And I want to give you a sense of a rather more uplifting vision that these Puritans had of what the work ethic really entailed. So I'm going to introduce you to Robert Sanderson. Here he is. He lived from 1587 to 1663. He wrote a very famous and delivered a very famous sermon called Ad Populum, where the topic was, one of the topics was like this enormous sermon. Remember, that people are in the church pews for hours on end on Sunday. So he had a lot to talk about, but a big chunk of what he was talking about was, how do you find your calling? That is your specialized occupation to which God has called you to dedicate your work life. Okay, how do you find it? And he's kind of working through the logic of the work ethic. And he says something really, really interesting. So let me just one thing he said is, don't expect God to appear to you in a dream and just tell you. That's not how it works. Puritans, believe it or not, were actually pretty hard-headed empiricists about this. Okay, they didn't really believe that God talked to us directly for the most part. Well, first of all, you have to determine what is a calling after all. It's not merely something that makes money by any means possible. Rather, it has to be honest work that advances the good of other people. And that already immediately eliminates all kinds of occupations such as gambling or idle speculation. Think about everybody going into finance these days. That doesn't count as honest work. You have to actually literally be helping other people. That's the criterion. And it has to be, something that requires some discipline to it, not just waking up one day and like doing a favor for somebody, right? You have to be dedicated to it. Okay. So, and then, okay, think about like, what are you good at, right? What are your talents and what are you trained up for? Like what kind of education you have? Could you actually like perform this job well? Okay. And then he says, well, look into what you're actually enthusiastic about. Like, do you enjoy exercising the talents and skills that are needed to perform this, to be good at your occupation? So there is a subjective element to this. And I'm reading this sermon and I'm thinking, wow, Sanderson right here in one Sunday invented modern career counseling, right? Pretty good, it's quite nice. Okay, and what he's really developing here is an ideal of meaningful and fulfilling work. Okay, if you find a job which is advancing the good of other people, and it demands skills that you enjoy exercising, and you're able to deploy those skills effectively, sounds like the kind of job that would yield some intrinsic value to the worker. They'll want to do this job, and they'll enjoy doing it. They'll find it meaningful. It's also the case here, turning back to Richard Baxter, who I introduced before, he was not at all the nose to the grindstone, just drudge away and don't complain about anything kind of preacher. On the contrary, he had very strong ideas about what workers' rights were that came from, this is very important, work is fulfilling God's command to everyone on earth that to the extent that they are able, we have a duty to help one another. Very simple proposition, okay? And when anyone fulfills that duty that God commands us and does it in the right spirit, that is in full recognition of the importance of this human being who they're serving, okay? Or maybe they're serving some larger public interest. So they're serving their commonwealth. Then they are any worker who performs their duties in their calling in God's anointed division of labor is the moral equal of every other worker, regardless of what job they do. Even the most menial worker is entitled to the same dignity as the most exalted worker, say, an ambassador to a foreign country or something. Why? Because they understood the division of labor, which God created in order to maximize, human welfare, needed specialization. And Sanderson actually described this as like the mechanism of a clock. Every gear in the clock is helping every other gear in the clock move. We're all helping each other move along and get along, right? Every gear represents a socially necessary, calling in a way. By analogy, the division of labor is like the mechanism of a clock. Everybody's doing socially necessary work. Okay, somebody's a street sweeper, but somebody has to do that, right? Right, they're doing God's work, and you have to respect them for that. Okay, so, right, every worker is entitled to dignity, and everyone is entitled to meaningful work. They were very upset, Puritans, at the discovery when they took a census of the poor that involuntary unemployment existed. It was a shock to them. They didn't think that was even possible, right? And they thought there's something disordered about society. We better find them jobs because that's what they want. Okay, everyone's entitled to honest labors, profitable to the Commonwealth. And employers have duties to workers. You can't rule them tyrannically. The CD, actually, these are citations, the Christian Directory, a 5-volume comprehensive guide to how to live your life as a good Christian. Okay. Don't boss them around like some abusive boss. They're doing God's work. You got to respect them. You have to provide safe and healthful conditions, pay fair living wages to them. You can't exploit them or abuse them. And if they become disabled, right, they're unable to work anymore, they have a right to charity. Not that you're all highfalutin and you just feel so great because you can give them a dollop of something. You have a duty to do so because they have a corresponding right to demand that of you if you have a surplus, that you can spare. Okay, and what did these Puritans say about business ethics? Well, in fact, they were very shrewd business ethicists. And I think we compare what they say to what 21st century business models I just discussed are how they're making their profits. Well, first thing is Baxter in his Christian Directory. Part of it's a really wonderful work of practical ethics. Part of it, he runs a little bit like an advice column today. I don't think he was actually receiving letters asking about certain things, but he kind of represented that, people are asking him these questions. And one of the questions was from a rich man who said, well, do I have to work? Can I just sort of fob off the duty to help other people by hiring other people to work? Kind of like, a draftee in the military, just hiring somebody else to fill their place in the army. And Baxter, no. He says, Baxter, he goes straight to the Bible. He says, when Adam was expelled from Eden, God told him, you have to work by the sweat of your brow to the end of your days. And he meant that for all human beings who were able to do so, period. That was an announcement to the idle landlords who didn't do a spot of work. They just got their living from charging rent to the occupants of the land, the farmers who were doing all the work, right? Okay. He also condemned all kinds of business models that were engaged in mere wealth extraction. He says it's a prison and a constant calamity to be tied to spend one's life doing little good to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. I wonder, how many people are in that position today. And back in the day, of course, it was mainly the landlords who were in that position. But today, we have our own people who have their own means of extracting wealth from other people, doing very little good for them. He has a whole chapter on oppression. He uses that word, oppression. Okay, and this chapter on oppression is basically describing all kinds of unfair and exploitative business models. He says, don't injure your inferiors who are unable to resist. You can't trample on people beneath you just because they're poor, desperate, whatever. He condemned monopolists, usurers, people. He didn't object to all interest, okay, but interest that was too high, predatory lending, you might say. Hucksters of various sorts who are hyping the value of the goods they're selling and that doesn't really measure up. And grocers, these are people who are trying to corner the market on some commodity in some locality. And unfair evictions of tenants. And remember, this is not just sort of residents and cottages, it's farmers who need to farm that land in order to feed their families. John Locke, who is a follower of the Protestant work ethic, I have a whole chapter in Hijacked in which I explain that the libertarian reading of Locke is 100% wrong, that he's like a pure work ethic guy. He has a little essay unpublished. You can find it online, actually, but not in any printed work, in which he condemns price discrimination. Specifically in times of famine, if you are willing to sell bread at a certain price to one customer, you are obligated to sell that loaf of bread at the exact same price to any other customer. Okay, you can't just look at a starving family and force them to hand over their, higher price just because you know that they're desperate. You're not allowed to take advantage of them or take advantage of the poor. So overall, what you see in these Puritans is a class-neutral ethic. Everybody has the same duties. Everybody has to play their part in the division of labor to help other people and not to oppress them. Okay. And why don't we, I think that's actually pretty sensible and decent business ethic. And let's see, let's measure up 21st century business models, not all of them, but some of them on this, against these standards. One thing that's very important, I think we can derive from these, from this work ethic, is that one should never confuse being really, really busy, making lots and lots of money with work that actually enhances the welfare of other people. Okay, it seems like we have quite a lot of busyness, making lots of money on things like crypto, okay, where what is the value added of this stuff? People are making billions off a very dubious pseudo asset, okay? It's not helping anybody else, right? It's important here. You have to be helping other people, not just yourself or your shareholders. And so we could ask, does that business model merely extract wealth? An awful lot of strategies, not all the strategies of private equity, but an awful lot of them are simple wealth extraction techniques. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. Does the business model exploit the vulnerable? Well, look at the practice of surprise medical bills, where somebody goes in for a few stitches in the ER and comes out with a surprise $15,000 bill. Seems vastly in excess of the value of what they got. Predatory credit works similarly. Does the business model profit by misleading people about their chances of success, like in multi-level marketing and for-profit scam schools, which have proliferated, which promise to teach you how to code, with naive students not being aware that they're being trained to code on obsolete machines in ancient coding language. It's no longer in use. Does the model shift risks to the vulnerable? So we see a practice these days of closing down pension funds and, sending them into bankruptcy and then promise benefits are a fraction of before. But what made the pensions bankrupt in the first place was that when at the time of a market boom, they pull out the so-called excess profits and distribute them to the shareholders so that in the crash, there's not enough left to fund the pensions of the workers. A very common strategy for shutting down pension obligations, fobbing them off on the federal government for a fraction of their original worth. Does the business model undermine future generations, like fossil fuel companies lobbying hard to oppose the green transition? Or does it spread hatred and propaganda and undermine democracy the way social media, so much of it, does today? None of these things be endorsed, and I think they shouldn't be endorsed. And Puritans had some pretty good principles here that help us understand why it's wrong. So now let's step back, because we need sort of a positive vision here, especially for workers who are working in direct human services, such as patient care. Where direct human services are going to be an increasing part of the labor force with the aging of the population and the need for people for direct care. So we need to think about, well, if we applied Sanderson's ideal of meaningful work, what would that look like for direct care work for other people? I will hold fixed, of course, all the pretty decent benefits and conditions of work that Baxter laid out, but think more about the content of work and the design of the actual job. What would that look like, keeping to Sanderson's criteria and interpreting that as a right of workers to a job that actually lets them exercise real skills that they enjoy exercising in the service of other people, okay? I think, in a way, what we see here in Sanderson's picture is something that, well, professional work has always aspired to, which is like you have some dignity and autonomy at work, and lots of skills, and in particular, a kind of value in the relationships that you develop with your students, your patients, your clients, depending on the profession, right? Often long-term relationships with the people you're serving, which themselves have a meaning to them, okay? It's always been the desire of professionals, if they could get it, to be either self-employed or in some kind of partnership that is like a workers' collective, right? That's essentially what a partnership is, except they do have underlings, but among themselves, their peers, and govern the enterprise collectively. And the other thing is control over the norms of quality service, right? That's always been a feature of professional work, right? The professionals determine what counts as quality service. Academics determine what counts as good pedagogy. Doctors determine what counts as quality patient care, and so forth. And I want to suggest a model, which we can get from the Netherlands, on how this works, known as the Hertzog model of home care work, okay? So home care workers in the United States are very poorly paid, often exploited. It's awful work and isolating, but how have they reorganized that in the Netherlands? A very interesting case. Well, what they did was they cut out the hierarchy and all the monitoring and top-down orders and paperwork. So why all this paperwork now that's infecting healthcare? It's precisely because these are employees who are accountable to managers, and managers want them. Yeah, how are they going to determine what are managers there for? To enforce the work ethic on workers who are not trusted with the autonomy to actually carry through on the mission that they're assigned. Okay, and how do you do that? By documenting your effort with mountains of paperwork. Okay, even physicians who are employees in large healthcare organizations now are spending half their day just documenting their effort. It's worse even than Elon, who only asks government workers to do that once a week. Right? Okay. It turns out that if you actually make the work fulfilling enough that people really want to do it and they don't feel burned out because they're enthusiastic about helping the patients, you can cut out all that paperwork. That leaves a lot of time to do the kind of relational work that is really meaningful in human services. Okay. So what they do is, instead of paperwork and documentation of effort and so forth, so that you can maximize your billing, which is typical in healthcare in the United States, instead what they do is they prioritize direct patient care. Dialogue with patients, listening to them, addressing their concerns, dialogue with other care workers within the family, right? Families, are supporting frail patients as well. Building relationships with the patient and with whoever in the family is taking care of them, perhaps friends, people in the community. Okay. Trying to figure out how best to serve this particular person. Okay. They work as teams. They're empowered to take initiatives in patient care, to use their judgment, to be creative in designing care strategies that fit the idiosyncrasies and the peculiar combination of healthcare problems that each patient suffers from, and also to focus a lot on preventative care. And they divide up the tasks among workers such that each nurse has skilled jobs as well as routine tasks that are less skilled. So everybody gets a decent mix. And so in this case, the hourly costs of delivering this care are higher. However, what results is healthier patients. And consequently, these patients need only half as many hours of care as before. So what you get is much more fulfilled workers who aren't suffering burnout and moral injury, who get meaningful work. They enjoy it. They want to do it. They're empowered by their mission, which they're dedicated to, sparing all that paperwork and supervision and bureaucracy and so forth. This, I think, is what a vision of reorganized home care work would be like. And of course, with teamwork too, if you have any worries about somebody slacking, well, there's other members of the team who notice that. A little bit of, mutual monitoring to keep everyone, on task and doing stuff. You don't need all this bureaucracy to do that. And this is something we also get from those old Puritans. They were not merely joyless, nose to the grindstone people. They were very serious morally, and I think give us a vision applicable today about how to make work more fulfilling for workers. Thank you.
Let's open it up to questions just to kind of get things kicked off. There was a pre-submitted question that came on online. We've got some online people. Online people, you can put questions in, and Penny will be able to relay those. People in the room can use your actual hands to give questions. But the first one we got was, what role did the congregational church covenants play in shaping the early Puritan business ethics you speak about?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. I did read it, and I'd really have to look at the details again. Mostly what I was reading is like sermons and the Christian Directory, which really is a magnificent work. It's not my theology, by the way. I'm not a Calvinist, but I did find it as a moral philosopher, very thoughtful, coming to grips with, real issues of their day, but also I think a more general ethic that, even applicable centuries later.
Question back, Gally. How can you explain that Weber missed so much of what the
Puritans had to say? How do you explain this gap?
Yes, and that's a great question. And in Hijacked, I answer it. So basically, what happened was at the time of the Industrial Revolution, what I argue is the work ethic split into two separate and competing traditions. So one was the version of the work ethic that was advanced by, the industrializing capitalists of their day. And they were very much in favor of the nose to the grindstone model, precisely because that's what would maximize their profits. But there was a pro-worker tradition, which runs through a sorted crew of pretty famous classical political economists, Adam Smith, who, by the way, almost every popular reader misreads. His reputation actually is almost the opposite of who he really was. A person who was truly sympathetic to ordinary workers, and his prime goal in The Wealth of Nations was to enhance the dignity, the prosperity, and the future prospects of workers. That's really what his mission was in The Wealth of Nations. But not just Smith, it runs through John Stuart Mill and a host of other figures, ending up through Marx, strangely enough. I have a very fun story to tell you about that. To a man named Edward Bernstein, who was the founder of social democracy in Europe. Okay, like the whole ideology comes out of Bernstein. And so the alternative tradition, which was realized on the continent of Europe, not in the UK so much, was social democracy, which had some important innovations, including co-determination, that is, workers and representatives of shareholders jointly managing the firm, both at what we would call in America the board of directors. They have a more complicated corporate governance scheme in Europe, as well as on the shop floor, joint worker management with representatives of the shareholders. And I will say that model has fallen on hard times under the pressure of sort of neoliberal global policies. But I'm totally with Thomas Piketty that's a model that's ripe for revival, and we could strengthen it. So yeah, there is this other tradition, and Weber, I think, writing at the, he's doing the research for this in the early 1900s, and he social democracy certainly was a force in Germany when he was writing, but I think at that point they had not won an election. So the first social democratic country was Sweden, and they didn't actually get to rule until I think around 1932. So really, he wasn't seeing any part of this other tradition fully realized in an actual set of policies yet.
Thank you.
Do it online?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
Penny,
we
what do we
have a
have?
few online. The first one is from Robert. Can you contrast and compare the Puritan ethic to the papal encyclicals on labor and work?
Now that is super interesting too. So it is true that there is in the Catholic tradition a critique of both capitalism and socialism, but there is a strong pro-worker line in the Catholic tradition as well. And indeed, some of the business ethics that these Puritans came up to is really just coming straight out of Catholic doctrines. There are modifications. I mean, back in earlier in the history of Christianity, the prohibition on usury, charging interest on loans, was much stricter, which is why Jews got into finance, since they weren't subject to that prohibition. The Puritans didn't think that it was wrong to charge interest at all. They didn't call that usury. They recognized that there was some business need to charge interest, but they did want to make sure that it was not extended on predatory terms. So they're more compatible with sort of modern, ways of doing business in that way. But you can see them that worry about they're more worried, I would say, about just predation and extractive extending credit in this exploitative way, taking advantage of people, than they are with the very idea of charging interest. Typically in those days too, when people extended loans, it would typically go along with business advice. So they are providing a service and not just cash to the recipients. So it counted more as like work than modern sort of purely speculative lending.
In the room, yeah.
Yeah, I found this really persuasive and humanizing, so thank you. I'm wondering if you have ideas about how the relationship between education and specifically the liberal arts education and this idea of work.
Yes.
Because it's still, I mean, while really humane, it's still useful work. So what's the role of kind of something that's human that's not useful?
Yeah, so that is a really great question. Just keep in mind that, the Puritans developing the work ethic, they're in the 16th and 17th century. So what were universities then? Well, in England, you have Oxford, you have Cambridge. They've been around for a long time, and mostly what they were training was preachers. And to a certain degree, in the 17th century, aspiring members of parliament. So it was a very different scene back then. And they didn't actually, so this is fascinating, what the curriculum actually was. So we do know, I think it's common knowledge, perhaps, that Oxford and Cambridge were, they did study the classics, but not in the way we do today in the liberal arts. They studied Latin and Greek, okay? They didn't actually study the classics as we know them today. They studied Latin as a language and Greek, as ancient Greek as a language. And then they were required to actually compose and make speeches in these languages, like compose essays or something. And there's a wonderful address by John Stuart Mill when he was named Chancellor of the University of St. Andrews, a beautiful university in Scotland. He gave an address in which he absolutely condemned this ridiculous curriculum where they're studying, the Greek language and the Latin language without actually seriously reading, Plato, Aristotle, the great Greek plays and so forth. He wanted them to actually be studying the literature that was written at the time. and Mill's just saying they have the curriculum all wrong. Like, what's the point of learning how to write, compose in Greek or Latin today? It didn't really make any sense. This is an obsolete curriculum. He rips into them for that. And indeed, throughout the whole history of classical political economy, you see this deep vein of skepticism at what Oxford and Cambridge were doing. John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith was equally dismissive of the education that they got then. And if you go back earlier in the 17th century, Hobbes thought that they were just schools of sedition. So they were not the liberal arts as we understand them today. That came later, and to a certain degree, the liberal arts really, it's quite interesting. They had a fuller realization in the United States than in England or Europe more generally. The United States really is the heart of liberal arts education as we know it. Whereas, in Europe, you have to specialize ridiculously early. Like you have to state what your major is practically before you even enter. You're admitted into a major. Whereas we actually give our students time to explore. And the beauty of that, one of the great advantages of the liberal arts system is, the one thing, it just gives students more time, but also I think it makes them better and smarter that when they go to college, they experience a range of disciplines. And look at the ILR. I mean, it's very interesting school, and I think properly organized, because if we want students to be able to be prepared to tackle the hard problems of the day, that's a multidisciplinary project, and people have to have appreciation for the knowledge and skills and perspectives of a variety of disciplines and be able to connect and communicate with them. It helps to already have at least had some experience in these other disciplines, but because the solution of every important social problem, requires people who are, different kinds of expertise, and liberal arts training, I think, gives people the flexibility and communicative skills to work better. So I'm like total enthusiast, but in fact, Europe's kind of a laggard. It's really here, and to a certain degree, Scotland actually was maybe the original innovator, and then the United States early in its history got a lot of faculty from Scotland who planted the strong liberal arts tradition in the United States.
Should we maybe do an online and then we'll come back into the room? Yeah,
Sure.
question.
So Bob from online asked, John Maynard Keynes said we only need to work 16 hours per week. And David Graeber noted that 30 to 50% of current jobs are unnecessary. How do we shape work to be meaningful if many of them are inherently meaningless?
Yeah. It's a great question. So a couple of years ago, I taught a seminar on work, philosophy of work, to my undergraduates. And we actually read some of David Graeber's fun book called Bullshit Jobs. I met David, by the way. Unfortunately, he died. It was terrible. But just like a very, engaging person. So I asked my students, had they ever worked at a bullshit job after, assigning some of Graeber's book, and a whole bunch of students raised their hands. And so obviously I want the stories, like what were these bullshit jobs? And my favorite example was somebody who was an intern at some fancy corporation and was, assigned some kind of business analysis. They had to write reports, right? And then they would upload their reports, some financial analysis, upload their reports to a shared, system. And the system actually kept count of downloads. Okay. And so he looked, and nobody downloaded all these reports he was writing. And so he realized that his job was to write reports that nobody would read. That's an excellent example of a bullshit job. But I think even Graeber says, don't take the statistic 40% of workers think their job is meaningless. When even Graeber thought, he's tossing that out there. but he didn't think that statistic could bear a lot of weight. He was being a little polemical because some people, it was just that certain tasks they were asked to do in their job were bullshit. That is either unnecessary or pernicious from their point of view. But of course, everybody has, no work design is perfect, right? So there's always going to be some garbage in anybody's job, including academics, right? You think is unnecessary. There are inefficiencies in that, but you don't think your whole job, is meaningless. And, getting back to Keynes now, yes, he thought that we cut the workday 16 hours. Now, it's very interesting. Keynes, when he wrote that essay, it's a lovely essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, that he wrote about 100 years ago, approximately. And good economist that he was, he said 100 years hence, so right around now, the GDP per capita would be about 5 times what it was 100 years ago. And, I actually ran the numbers for the United States, the United Kingdom, and lo and behold, he was spot on. He was really good economist. He figured it out. And so he thought, well, look, what's all the point of toiling away? And it is true that if you look at labor expended, it has been going down for sure. Because it used to be that a typical worker, would work 60 or 70 hours. And now most workers work 40 or less. The Germans actually lead the way in the fewest hours, of work. Of course, because you're throwing in all the paid vacations that the continental Europeans get. That really, if you're Danish, you get 7 weeks of paid vacation. Imagine, it's mind-boggling. 7 weeks? That's almost 2 months of the year. It's unimaginable for Americans to think about that, that it could even be possible. Now Iceland has a 4-day work week. So, it's not 16 days. They're still actually working serious hours on the other days. But, the question is, there's a lot of jobs which you really just have to put in the time. And I don't think it's really feasible to get to 16, especially if we look ahead to the future and think about climate change. Massive amounts of infrastructure have to be built. There are all kinds of crises that are going to require lots and lots of labor. The aging of the population, increased demand for labor there. So I don't quite buy Keynes's prediction. And it turns out that workers, although they want to work less than they did back then, they generally want to work more than 16 hours. Now, you might say, of course, for the people who are nose to the grindstone at some drudgy job, that's horrible. And yeah, that's horrible. But I think what we should do then is do job redesign, to put some meaning in that work. But it's just an awful lot of work that needs to be done. So I don't really believe Keynes's optimism about that. Our standards have risen. I mean, back then people were just thinking, well, I just need enough food. We have more complex needs now, partly because we're able to do things that we couldn't do before, especially in the realm of healthcare. Back then, there wasn't too much you could do. So there isn't many hours to be devoted to healthcare. Well, now we can do a lot, and there's a lot of hours that need to be devoted.
Yeah, Devin and I had first hand.
Yeah, this is a curiosity question. Right, so Marxist feminists really kind of draw, within like social reproduction theory, really draw our attention to all of these sort of unpaid care work that goes around supporting the wage labor relationship, right? And I'm just curious if these sort of early sort of Protestants had any kind of understanding between the difference of wage labor and unpaid work, and then like how these things relate to each other, or if not. And I'm curious if this at all kind of factors into their thinking.
So I mean, not in this social reproduction thing exactly, but Baxter actually takes note of the fact that a lot of women's work is raising the kids. Okay, and he says, well, they're performing the work ethic too. Because, right, what they're doing is child development. Basically, they're helping child development, which is kind of like teaching, essentially. They're teachers. And he recognized that, it's within the family, so they're not getting paid a wage or anything. But he insisted that women raising their own children in their family were doing socially necessary labor, helping others in a disciplined way. That is, discipline really comes down to the fact that you're serving other people's needs, and other people's needs do not arise on a schedule that matches your sense of your own convenience, right? That's why discipline is needed, right? You have to muster yourself up to address their needs, even if it isn't so convenient for you, even if you don't feel like it. And I think that insight is basically right. And Baxter said, look, they're doing God's work too, right? So they're entitled to equal dignity, assuming they're actually doing it. He did actually have some bad words to say about the daughters of the idle rich who spent their time gossiping and playing cards and other sort of worthless tasks and fobbed off child rearing to some wet nurse or something. He wasn't so fan of aristocratic modes of raising children.
Lisa?
Yeah, thanks for this. So, yeah, there's something still about the term work ethic that I chafe at.
Yeah.
Right, so I've got a lot of questions spinning around, and what I'd like to ask you about is the issue of democracy and how far that can be pushed in terms of envisioning more of a good life as opposed to a work ethic. And so like the European model, I think is more of the idea of the good life, and that work is part of that as opposed to a work ethic in particular. And then the idea of democracy at work itself, like, you have like collective self-governance and team production, but a notion of collective self-governance more along the lines of at least an ideal in universities, right? Seems to be part of, again, that notion of not just the work ethic, but the meaningful, interesting work in which you're connected to it.
Yeah.
Right. So even work that is kind of dreary work, but is necessary to do if there's this notion of democracy, that there's a more than sharing the wealth, it's sharing the power, right? And so I think that idea of collective democracy through unions, through different ways of forming worker collective control is where this is going. But
Yes.
I wonder, how much does that come out of your study of this kind of interesting division of how Puritan work?
Right. Well, democratic control, of course, is coming. That's where social democracy is leading, which gives us one model. It's joint control. So you're not shutting out the shareholders. But there's a somewhat more radical tradition, which is all about like promoting workers' cooperatives. And John Stuart Mill, he wrote in his Principles of Political Economy a famous chapter called The Futurity of the Working Classes, which he wrote under the influence of his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, who was much more radical than John Stuart, by the way, and a very strong feminist, and pushed him in a feminist direction, whereby he wrote The Subjection of Women, which I think was actually, in many respects, her ideas. But he was a great champion of workers' collectives, and they're actually, in a way, surprisingly, they actually don't go well together. So it's a very interesting study of what happened in Swedish social democracy, which is by far the most successful social democratic case, because social democrats were in control in Sweden for 40 years, uninterrupted years, an astonishing record. But it turns out that workers' cooperatives are very rare in Sweden. And you think that's kind of surprising with our long social democratic tradition. But the reason why is that social democracy was always founded on a labor union model. And labor unions powered social democracy in all the countries that established it. And labor unions, they saw workers like running off and founding their own firm as like aspiring capitalists. So they weren't interested in supporting that. That's like these workers would break off and just get on the other side of the bargaining table. And so, in fact, workers' cooperatives aren't really all that common. They're they're surprisingly common in the United States. There are, there are organizations that support workers' cooperatives and share knowledge about how to do it. The biggest issues actually are getting workers on board and realizing that this is like a possibility. For most American workers, it's almost beyond their imagination. But once they actually learn about it, it's pretty cool, and they get onto it. I happen to have in my home a heat pump hot water heater manufactured by a company that is a workers' cooperative. You see them, wouldn't even necessarily know if you didn't ask, because they're not advertising that fact. But they're there.
Dina?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is not super developed, but I was just wondering, have you thought about how this applies in the context of migrant domestic work?
Yeah, that's a really tough case. I mean, are you talking about undocumented?
No, I mean, I work on labor and employment in the Middle East, and
primarily slaves in the Middle East. It's like an unbelievable disaster. And I have given some thought to that because there are some cases in the United States, and it reminds me. So I've done some studies of post-emancipation labor organization in the United States. So, like, what happened to the freed people? And even during the Civil War, it turns out that the Union Army conducted experiments in labor organization because you had all of these basically fugitives for slavery escaping behind the Union lines. The story of emancipation de facto on the ground during the Civil War was mostly a story of self-emancipation. Right? These enslaved people see the Union Army coming, and they just run to get on the other side of the line. So they emancipate themselves this way. But then, of course, then they're in need of something to do so they could feed themselves and their families. And the Union Army actually ran some pretty creative experiments with dividing up the plantations they were occupying into separate farms and having the freed people just sort of manage for themselves. But they also experimented with, employment, wage labor kind of relations. And here was a really interesting innovation that they created, which they also enforced on the South during Reconstruction. And that was, you have a labor contract, but this was largely with people who had been deprived of literacy, so they couldn't really read the contract. They would be told orally what they would be paid for their work on another person's land if they were in a wage relationship. But the union knew perfectly well that they couldn't trust the employers, many of whom were former planters with slaves, to follow through in the contract. And so what they did is they sent actual members of the Army who were trained for this job, where the wages would be paid. There's a system where, remember, it's a cash poor society. So they would be paid after the crop was sold, and the planters actually had cash to disperse. So they'd be paid once a year. And a Union soldier had to be present and had records of what was promised and had to observe the money actually exchange hands on the terms that had been promised in the contract. So you basically had direct contract enforcement right there. The contract had to be public, had to be sent to a public authority. Public authority had to be able to confirm that the terms were respected. And I think there could be some role for that in domestic labor today.
Maybe one last question. Yeah, at the back there.
How do you think this would all apply and like what the Puritans thought to the concept of modern charity? I think people talk a lot about charity being ineffective because it doesn't actually like restructure this idea of the work ethic? What do you think the Puritans would have to say about that?
Well, the Puritans were always wringing their hands over charity. And the difficulty was, so in the 17th century, they actually commissioned a census of the poor because they wanted to find out. So the poor laws were established. Essentially what happened was you have the Reformation under Henry VIII, and Henry VIII seizes all of the monasteries and their lands. Okay. And then, but the monasteries had been the ones who had been providing charity for the poor. Okay, well, you gotta like substitute for that. And that's why the poor law became the first nation in Europe to actually assume provision for the poor as a national responsibility. Although in fact, it ended up being like divided up into all the different parishes. So each parish, it was their responsibility to take care of their poor. And the Puritans were constantly wringing their hands over it, how to do this. Do you just hand out cash, or should you create some kind of real jobs for the poor? That's what they tried in the 17th century, a kind of workfare kind of thing. Only what they really wanted wasn't workfare. What they wanted is they provide, this is back in the day when cottage industry was a thing. Like people would be weaving cloth and spinning thread in their homes. And so that maybe they'd supply a loom and maybe some woolen thread, and then the poor could be making cloth. Okay. And then that could be sold. That was the theory. Never worked out. It was incredibly costly, and it was impossible for them to actually make enough to survive that way. And so maybe you should just go back to cash, or in the 17th century, late 17th century, and really mostly deep into the 18th and 19th centuries, you have a workhouse. Send them to a workhouse and force them to work there. Horrible, just an unmitigated disaster in every way. And also super expensive. So what you see in British welfare policy was constantly cycling around these different strategies, none of them really being satisfactory. And then along came my hero, one of my heroes of Hijacked, the great Tom Paine. Thomas Paine was the first, we think of it, like revolutionary pamphleteer, but in fact, he came up with the first credible, realistic plan to abolish poverty using tax numbers from the British Treasury. Okay, and how do you abolish poverty? Social insurance, a brilliant scheme. So he used numbers from the tax receipts of the British Treasury, and he really calculated like real numbers, like how much revenue could be raised. He had to jigger the tax system because he really wanted to do it with an estate tax, essentially. Get the money that way. But there were good figures back then. And then you had to figure out, well, how many people, would be needing old age pensions, disability insurance, and survivor's insurance if the breadwinner dies and you have widows and orphans and so forth. Decent census numbers around the time of, late 18th century, decent, monetary figures. He costed it out, figured out, how much it would take to prevent people from falling into poverty due to old age, disability, and loss of a family's loss of a breadwinner. Okay. And he you can cover all the expenses just with universal insurance and social insurance. And the great thing about this is that it would be universal, and because everybody would get it regardless, it would not be stigmatizing, right? The problem with the poor law is receipt was stigmatizing and it branded you as like a horrible person who maybe did something, was irresponsible or lazy or something, or suspect in some way. But if everybody's entitled and everybody gets it, how could there be a stigma? There's no, you know, negativity associated with a universal benefit. And it's also super efficient because you don't have to waste your time testing, well, are they really poor? Are they cheating? You know, forget about it. No, everybody just gets it. So you wipe out all the bureaucracy and all the intrusive, demeaning questions that are asked. It's a brilliant system, and that by far is the most successful form of welfare provision in the United States. Is social insurance. It dramatically cut the poverty rate for the elderly, who used to have like a super high poverty rate. It's much lower now. A little more generosity, you know, could just eliminate it entirely. So something like that, I think, would make sense. But then for the working poor, look, we got to be raising wages. There's no reason to have this micro division of labor whose sole purpose is, you know, just to maximize profits. Okay, profits need to take a hit by raising the wages. And we do know from wonderful, you know, natural experiments, terrific economists have found that there's quite a lot of room to raise the minimum wage without increasing unemployment. We should be doing that. And then, you know, to all of the conservatives who say we don't want people on welfare, well, you know, we wouldn't have to actually raise so much taxes to pay for welfare if workers had decent wages. Then they wouldn't need food stamps, right? Then they could pay for their food out of their own wages. Imagine that. So then you could shrink the welfare state because workers are making decent wages. You know, you can think there are a lot of proposals already out there that are perfectly feasible and could be done to enable people to get access to resources that they need without having to suffer all the stigma and the intrusive questions and regulation and so forth by the authorities.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Anderson for a fascinating talk, delving into many really interesting topics. Hand for President. Everybody online for joining us.